start with history? Because actually your background in terms of as an economic historian played well for the role you were taking. I don't think you were necessarily hired for that, but it came as a huge benefit. As a student of the Great Depression, what do you think you learned and the economics profession had learned from the Great Depression? And how did you then apply it?
Well, we did learn, I think, quite a bit from the Depression, and we'll probably get into it, but also from banking panics even prior to that in the 19th century, before the Federal Reserve. I think there were a couple of lessons from the Great Depression that were very helpful. The first was, as Milton Friedman and Anna Schwartz showed in their monetary history, the collapse of the money supply and the deflation was a very important factor in the Depression, and it was spread around the world because at the time we had a gold standard, which meant that if one country deflated, others would as well. So maintaining adequate monetary accommodation, maintaining stability in prices was important. And so we were very aggressive, of course, on monetary policy through the period, not just after Lehman, but even prior to that. The other factor, somewhat hard to explain why, but the Fed was very passive in the 30s about preventing the collapse of the banking system. And it was a very different kind of crisis. We didn't have the big international banks failing as we did this time, but about a third of the small banks in the country, United States, failed, bringing down the money supply and also contracting credit and disrupting economic activity. Again, the Fed was very passive about that. So the other lesson, I think, was to try to stabilize the financial system, and that there's a huge connection between the financial system and the economy, and you can't ignore that. So those were two things that we did. I think generally the response, one thing you see is going from Hoover to Roosevelt in the United States, for example, is the shift from orthodoxy to experimentation. Roosevelt came in, the economy was in the deep, deep depths of the Depression in 1933. Orthodoxy was not working, and so he was not a great economist by any means. He tried lots of different things, but the thing he was willing to do was to experiment and do something unorthodox. And some of those things worked well. Deposit insurance and going off the gold standard were constructive at that time. Some of the other things he did weren't so constructive, but the point was he was willing to take chances and to experiment and not to be a slave to the orthodoxy of the time. And that was, I think, also a lesson that we tried to take from history.
So Roosevelt, as you say, experimented a lot. Are there other people that you felt during that Great Depression that showed true leadership, or was it a time of mediocrity?
Well, it wasn't mediocrity so much as confusion. A book I would recommend very highly to this audience is a book called Lords of Finance by Liaquat Ahmed, A-H-A-M-E-D, and it's about the four principal central bankers during the 1930s, the US, UK, France, and Germany. Very interesting. These were very distinguished men with tremendous experience and so on, but they were all slaves to the orthodoxy, and they didn't really understand what was happening, and so they never were able to break through and deal with the crisis. So I don't think that was an area of great leadership. I mentioned Roosevelt because of his willingness to be unorthodox. A name you might not have ever heard of, which I actually think is quite interesting, is the Japanese minister, Takahashi. Was very daring. Early in the 1930s, he took Japan off the gold standard. He then instituted major fiscal expansion, and Japan recovered very quickly. And of course, that ultimately took Japan into the pre-World War II militarist regime. Takahashi was assassinated by the militarists in the early 30s, but he was really quite a remarkable character. So there were a few. One of the main differences between the 30s and now was the state of international relations. This was, of course, after World War I. Hitler came in 1933. During this whole period, Germany, France, US, UK were not at all in cooperation. There was a lot of bad feeling, and and that prevented a lot of kinds of international coordination that would have been helpful in this crisis. I think that somebody will write, a great history of the international aspects of the crisis, because as central bankers, as G20 ministers and central bankers, leaders, there was a great deal of coordination, really very close coordination. I worked very closely with Trichet and Draghi and Mervyn King and Mark Carney and so on. And that coordination was very helpful. There was quite an important difference from the 30s.
Moving on from history, but what do you think, having studied that period, what help did it give you when you first kind of realized that something major was starting to take place?
Well, there's the general point, and again, I'm working on a book on this now. I'm sitting at the Brookings Institution, which is a think tank in Washington, D.C., and trying to think through, the whole experience. From the time I became a governor in 2002, and I was with Alan Greenspan during the run-up to the crisis. I was in the White House, then I became chairman. After the crisis, we had to deal with monetary policy, and so on. So I'm trying to think through all these things. And one set of things that turns out, I think, be very helpful in thinking about the crisis is going back to the 19th century, before the Fed, when the U.S. and other countries were subject to periodic banking panics. And we thought those were a thing of the past because we have deposit insurance in the United States, so you no longer have small depositors coming to pull their money out of the bank. But when we began to analyze what was happening, it really wasn't just subprime mortgages. I mean, subprime mortgages were a trigger. But what really made the crisis big was that there was the modern equivalent of a banking panic, in that the funding of banks and other financial institutions was majority through uninsured short-term funding like repo markets, commercial paper markets and the like, and you had an old-fashioned run, and the run caused the system to nearly implode. And it took a while to see the connections because it was taking place in a very different institutional context. But the basic analysis of traditional, 19th century banking panics was actually very helpful in thinking about what was happening. So I didn't anticipate it, but I got into monetary policy because of an interest in history, and because Friedman and Schwartz and others had shown that monetary policy can make an enormous difference, and that's been true for hundreds of years. The Bank of England, 1694, was founded. So the history turned out to be perhaps even more valuable than the economics per se, because it gave you the broader picture of what was happening, not just in the narrow economics, but in the politics and all the other factors that were so important.
So the crisis started. It's the worst crisis. It unfolds, starts slowly and then unfolds very, very fast. I mean, it's a question with a number of parts, is what was it like to be the central banker at the center of this? What was it like to be the leader of that organization? What was it like to be an economist? Because usually you can kind of stand from the sidelines and watch everything and opine, but you're in the thick of it. And then also, what was it like as an individual?
Well, not so pleasant.
Yeah.
So one of the things that you have to fight against when you think about this is what psychologists call hindsight bias. Anything that happened must have, was inevitable to happen. And it's always painful for me. Recently they put out the Federal Reserve releases the transcripts of the FOMC meetings with a 5-year lag. And so the 2007, 2008 transcripts are out there, and I cringe a little bit because, we're saying 2008, after Bear Stearns, the financial system had calmed down some, and there was some growth. The economy was growing. Inflation was almost 5% because of an oil price shock. And so we were trying to think about the balance between inflation and the growth risks. And so, we would say in the meetings, well, what about inflation? Let's think about inflation. And reading it today, you say, well, what are they worried about inflation for? Don't they know that a few months later the whole system is going to come crashing down practically? Of course we didn't. I mean, that's the nature of these things. It's very analogous. Fortunately, no one gets killed in financial crises generally, but it's very analogous to war in the sense that there's a very complicated event, very hard to predict. You're dealing with imperfect, incomplete information. And so there was this continual effort to try to figure out what was really happening, how bad was it. We wanted to be forceful, we wanted to address the issues, but we didn't want to overreact either. And early on, in 2007, early 2008, our sense was that maybe this was closer to something like 1998, the debt crisis or something, Russian debt crisis, than it was the 1930s. And as time passed, we saw that it was actually worse than that, and we adjusted as quickly as we could. So it was very difficult to deal in the fog of war with what was happening. The politics was terrible. I was always spent a lot of my time talking to Congress, talking to individual legislators, and it was just a feeling of being always, bombarded by one incredible problem or issue after another. So it was very tough. I think that from a personal point of view, that way I described it once was, if you're in a car wreck and your car is spinning on the icy highway, your whole focus is on trying to get control of the car. And then when finally you come to a stop at the side of the road, you say, oh my gosh, that was a scary thing. Well, during the crisis, so much was happening all the time, so many challenges, so much uncertainty, that your focus was very much on the next problem and the next decision. And you tried not to take too much of a look at the broad picture because it was daunting. So it was very challenging. And people ask me, what would you have done differently, that kind of thing. I'm sure that many things could have been done differently, but always remember that we didn't know in advance, what we know now, of course, and so that it made those decisions quite complex.
You talk about the politics being difficult. It's easy to forget that actually it was an election year, presidential election year, with no incumbent candidates running for
That's
the
right.
presidency. So you had an incumbent president, and then you had two potential challengers. Did that make your job even harder? Because in a sense, as you want to work in a world.
It definitely did make it harder. And in fact, it was terrible because the height of the crisis was September and October of '08. The election was beginning of November. I was trying best I could to keep both candidates, Senator Obama and Senator McCain, I was trying to keep them informed. And mostly trying to keep them from doing anything that would interfere too much with what we were trying to accomplish. Senator McCain, in the middle of the campaign, decided he was going to, quote, suspend his campaign and come to Washington and solve the problem, which was a big mistake on his part. It was not very helpful in general. So he called a meeting, and President Bush, we were talking about leaders. Like I said, President Bush, he really stood up and let Paulson and me do what we thought we needed to do, even though it was very unpopular. President Bush called the meeting in the White House. McCain was there. McCain didn't say a word. The whole thing was a fiasco. Mostly we were trying to, keep the candidates from doing too much damage because there was all this fighting going on. Meanwhile, the Republican nominating convention put a plank in their platform. There should be no more bailouts. This was before Lehman. So the politics was pretty poisonous. Then after the election occurred, of course, in early November. In the 1930s, there was initially a 5-month hiatus between the election and the assumption of power by the new president. That is, President Roosevelt was elected in early November of 1932. He didn't become president until March of 33, and that interim period was a period of tremendous stress, and neither president felt comfortable taking decisive action. So the Constitution was changed to bring the inauguration up to January, so it was only a 3-month hiatus. But even so, that period was very hard, and the Federal Reserve was the only element of continuity, because the Bush Treasury was going out and the Obama Treasury was coming in, and we were trying at the Fed. We were trying to, work with both administrations without creating, unnecessary leaks or conflicts. It was challenging, and it came at a bad time. It made the whole task even more difficult, because there was no one who could take the decisive actions that were needed at that particular moment.
And during that interregnum period, that's like in November to the middle of January, did you start working very closely with, well, of course, Obama hadn't even had a chance to have his nominees confirmed in terms of Treasury Secretary, etc.
Right, well, that's right. But fortunately, so it could have gone very differently. But during the campaign, Senator Obama, at the recommendation of Larry Summers, began to talk regularly to Tim Geithner, who at the time was the head of the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. So he was part of the Fed system. And Obama and Geithner really hit it off, and Obama liked Geithner's analysis. And Obama decided to appoint Geithner to be Secretary of the Treasury, even though they'd barely known each other before the campaign, which, in a way was very surprising, because, if I'm coming in as a new president and you have this guy Geithner, who, as much as anybody, was identified with the bailouts and some of the problems, you would think that you want to have a fresh start and put in somebody else. But he stuck with Geithner, even though Geithner, he had some tax issues and things of that sort. So I give Obama a credit for that. And Geithner turned out to be his probably most important advisor, at least on the domestic side. But for me, it was very good, because I've been working with Tim for years at this point. And so we had a close relationship. The Treasury was very understaffed, because it takes an unconscionably long time for the Senate to confirm the various political appointments for positions in the Treasury. And so Geithner was relying very much on Fed talent, Fed staffers to do the work. So there was a really great opportunity there to work closely with Geithner as he came in. And I think that turned out to be very helpful in the transition period.
You just mentioned briefly you were obviously appointed by President Bush, and then you were actually reappointed by President Obama. Very, very different presidents in style and substance. What's your observations about both of them, particularly in this time of crisis?
Well, I think I developed very close relationships with both of them. I had a somewhat closer relationship with Bush, because he appointed me and I worked for him in the White House for a while, but I had close relationships with both of them. I thought they both had their hearts in the right place, so to speak, in the sense that they understood the severity of the problem. They were willing to take hard decisions and to stand up for those decisions, even if they were unpopular. Both of them were very respectful of the independence of the Federal Reserve. Bush always was, and Obama, when he was on the campaign trail, he made a point of coming to visit me in my office at the Fed, which I thought was kind of nice, and to come in and say, and talk to me, and we discussed the issues. And then he said, just want you to know, Ben, that, I have great respect for the Federal Reserve, and the Federal Reserve will always be independent under my administration. And, and that was, he followed through on that. So I had great relations with both of them. And in both cases also, in fact, even though I had been in the Republican White House, I had more connections with the Democratic staff. I knew Larry Summers for 30 years. I knew Geithner obviously very well. Christy Romer, who was Obama's head of the Council of Economic Advisors, was an long-time colleague of mine. We played bridge together for years and years ago. Gene Sperling, Alan Kruger, I could go on and on. So I really felt that I had the confidence and the ear of the administration. And in Washington, the dynamic recently, and this is both Republican and Democrat, is that the administration, the president, has to kind of be the grown-up, because Congress is just this battlefield of conflicting ideologies and non-cooperative behavior. It's really a tremendous problem. So it usually falls to the president to try to be, again, the grown-up who's trying to advance the overall objectives. And so, again, both Bush and Obama took it very seriously, and they relied, of course, I was very happy with the fact that both of them were comfortable relying on me and on their Treasury Secretary to lead the government's effort to stop the crisis.
I think it was interesting. I was looking at the stats on your reconfirmation vote in the Senate, and it was 70-30.
Right.
And that, given what you'd been through, was a great vote of confidence. But did you take some comfort in the fact that on one hand you had Tom Harkin from Iowa on the liberal left of the Democrat Party, and Sam Brown back on the extreme right of the Republican Party voted against you, that you felt you must have been doing something right?
Well, yes. So 70, you can think of 70-30 as a vote of confidence. Of course, it was also by far the worst vote ever for a confirmation of Fed chairman. And it was my belief that Bloomberg had an automatic button so that whenever they hit the name Ben Bernanke, it automatically said afterwards, confirmed 70-30, the worst vote ever recorded for the Federal Reserve chairman. So it was actually, my first time when I was confirmed 99-0. So 70-30 was not exactly going in the right direction. But the thing is, and this, quite frankly, there's an American comedian named Lily Tomlin, and one of her favorite sayings, which I've adopted as sort of a motto, is, "I try to be cynical, but I just can't keep up." And I felt that very often in Washington, and one of the places that really was striking was how often a congressman would, just excoriate me in public, and then come up later and say, "I think you're doing a great job. I don't pay attention to what I said in public. I didn't mean any of it. After the 70-30 vote." So I'm going to tell you a story. After the 70-30 vote, I got a phone call from a prominent senator who had voted against me, and he said, "Listen, I'm calling. I just want to tell you, I'm sorry I had to vote against you," he said, "but sometimes you have to throw red meat to the knuckle draggers." That was what he said. And I said, "Well, that's a very high opinion you have of your constituents there, Senator." But basically, American politics is very polarized. The level of discourse is very low. And unfortunately, and I can't say I don't understand this, the crisis has helped to spawn extreme right and extreme left movements. I know it's the same in Europe as well. On the right, we have the Tea Party. In the 2012 presidential race, Governor Rick Perry of Texas, who was running for president, Tea Party favorite, said about me, he said I was basically a traitor. So I thought that was a little strong.
But then again, he couldn't remember which departments he was abolishing, so you weren't. It's good to have good enemies.
Right. And then on the left, you have the Occupy Wall Street people and so on. And whenever I went to testify, there'd be people picketing or ladies dressed in pink. There was a pink lady thing. I don't even understand what that was about. So it was another analogy. I don't want to go too far off the track here, but the 1930s was also a period of a great deal of political, obviously, upheaval and unrest, marches on Washington and the like, and congressional commissions, explaining what happened in the Depression. This crisis was not as bad as that, but there was a lot of difficult politics, clearly, and the Fed, I'm happy to say that the Federal Reserve is now more popular among the American people than the Internal Revenue Service, which collects taxes. But for a time, that was not true. We were not particularly popular, and that made life even more difficult, of course.
I think I remember this group 4 years ago. We had Nassim Taleb, him of the famous Black Swans, and he half his speech was focused on how awful economists were and how that
He
they
really
frankly
doesn't like me at all.
Well, I don't think you're an economist. I think you've given it right from the beginning. Do you believe economists, the fact that we didn't have another Great Depression, the fact that the way that the central banks and the economists, do you believe to paraphrase, did economists have a good war?
No, I think we fought it to a draw. So, on the other hand, you have the Queen of England asking, well, what the hell happened, in her polite way. So there's some people who say, that this experience completely discredits modern economics, which I think is way too strong. I mean, I think that if you look at the various components of the crisis, if you look at the macroeconomics, if you look at the crisis itself, that existing economic analysis can help us understand it, at least retrospectively. But, on the other hand, economic analysis did not help us very much in identifying the risks in advance and addressing them in advance. So I think it's the people who say that economics has to be rebuilt from the bottom, everything we know is worthless. I think that's way too strong. I think that, much of what happened is fully explicable within the traditional economic frameworks. But I would say it's much too strong to say that we had a good crisis, because clearly many of the issues were not identified very quickly. And, the recoveries have not been as quick as we would like. And in particular, I think most importantly, we failed to see, and I say we, I think I would include almost all economists. It's one thing to say there are black swans and things can happen that you don't anticipate, but it's another thing to actually identify in advance what the black swan is going to be. And we didn't do a very good job of that. And one of the things that I've tried to do with the Fed was to try to substantially improve our ability both to identify emerging problems and to respond to financial risks.
The recovery's been slow, modest, some people say anemic. Do you believe more should have been done in 2008, 2009? You said earlier about hindsight's obviously an easy thing, but
I think that's right. I think the Fed was a little bit too optimistic. On the fiscal side, I actually do think I've come to the view that some people like Christy Romer have taken that even though the fiscal stimulus in 2009 was, the headline figure was quite large, that for various reasons it really wasn't big enough. One of the main reasons was that even though there was a big fiscal number at the federal level, in the United States, I think, this is true in some European countries as well, a great high proportion of government services are delivered at the state and local level. And U.S. states and localities tend to have balanced budget rules. They can't deficit spend except for in very limited circumstances. And so as the economy crashed and tax revenues dropped, state and local governments began to cut spending, postpone capital projects, fire employees, and so on. Huge effect, very powerful effect. And it offset probably a half to 2/3 of the federal fiscal stimulus. And then after that, people began to freak out about the increase in the deficit, which was 10% of GDP at the worst. And so there was a very rapid effort to try to rein that in and to essentially adopt an austerity type of program. And while I certainly believe that fiscal policy has to be sustainable in the longer term, I felt that the congressional response was too rapid and too severe. We had things like the sequester and other things that cut very sharply the government's budget. And I think that, in that respect, the stimulus of 2009 set forth a countervailing factor over the subsequent years that was actually quite counterproductive. On the Fed side, we did a lot. We got interest rates down to zero by December of 2008. But we were somewhat optimistic about the pace of recovery, and arguably we could have been even more aggressive. Yes. Now, having said all that, let me just say one more thing, which is that while the Fed tended to be over-optimistic about the pace of growth in the recovery, we actually were pessimistic about the rate at which the unemployment rate would fall. The unemployment fell more quickly than we thought. And if you think about unemployment as being the best indicator of the state of the business cycle, what that was saying is that the business cycle was proceeding more or less along the lines we anticipated, or maybe even more quickly in terms of the overall recovery. But what was not happening was that the total growth was low, and that reflected other factors, in particular the very low rate of productivity growth during this period. So it's been noted by a lot of economists that financial crises are often followed by slow growth. One of those reasons would be because in a financial crisis, it's very hard for new firms to be formed, for new products to be brought to market, for research and development, for venture capital, and all those things to work. And so some of the natural mechanisms for creating innovation are actually suppressed because the financial funding is not there. So productivity growth in the U.S. was actually pretty weak in the last few years, which is part of the reason why growth has been less than expected, even though the economy has moved at a reasonably rapid pace towards a more full employment kind of low unemployment type of situation.
You say you've reacted very quickly on reducing interest rates to zero. So obviously that tool got used heavily very early on. You then moved to the quantitative easing. And how do you respond to the idea? So we've done this for the last 6 years. It's worked. Has it worked? And if so, has it created a different problem is how you unwind it? Has that created uncertainty in its own right? So has part of the solution now become a different problem?
Well, if you read the FT today, I think Martin Wolf had a nice little article about quantitative easing, just a retrospective on quantitative easing. So the best assessments are that it did work. It was helpful, given that we were at zero interest rates. You needed some additional monetary stimulus, and quantitative easing appears to have been a useful supplement. We always thought of it as a supplement. We didn't want it to be thought of as the main tool, but it was a useful supplement to the low rate policy. And I'm quite confident that our use of quantitative easing is a reason why the U.S. economy is recovering and why we didn't have any real deflationary scare. So I think it was important. Now it's one of the disadvantages of using it is that it's unfamiliar. We didn't really have a very precise estimate of how effective it would be, and so it was hard to calibrate the size of the medicine, the dose of the medicine. And it did have various potential risks that we were monitoring very carefully. I think that one of the risks that some people were concerned about was absolutely bogus. There were a number of people early on who said that quantitative easing was going to lead to hyperinflation and a collapse of the dollar. I was told that many times in congressional hearings. And elementary economics tells you that just doesn't make any sense in a liquidity trap situation where interest rates are at zero and the economy is depressed. So we never thought that was a risk. And even so, we got, when we did QE2 in November of 2010, we got a letter from Congress saying, don't do this. It's going to be a disaster. It's going to cause inflation, da-da-da. So I think that was a place where we understood it much better than some of the critics. And the inflation risks, I think, are zero. So that's not really a concern. Now, there was some difficulty in unwinding. We all know about the taper tantrum and all that, which I'd be happy to talk about. And that was simply the fact that it was an unusual tool, and undoing it created some unanticipated effects on markets and market dynamics. But at this point, that's done, I think. I mean, I think everybody knows that QE is going to end, within a month. And so that unwinding looks, I mean, the difficult part is done. There's no need for the Fed to rush to bring down the size of its balance sheet because it has tools to raise interest rates as it needs to. So it can manage monetary policy, it can control inflation, it can add stimulus or take away stimulus, even if the balance sheet stays exactly where it is today. So a very slow policy of letting it run off over time is a perfectly legitimate and feasible policy. So I think we've seen, you know, the main risk, which was last summer, the taper tantrum. We're going to see probably some volatility and some uncertainty as the overall low interest rate policy unwinds. One of the just basic realities of monetary policy in the modern world is about 2% action, about 98% talk. And a lot depends when you have rates at zero for 6 years. The markets are responding not to, you know, rate changes, they're responding to what they think the central bank is going to do, and the central bank is trying to explain what it's going to do. And I've learned painfully that getting that communication, that signal exactly right is extremely difficult. And so, for example, one thing I know that the Fed is very concerned about is that whenever the time comes to, you know, begin gradually and gingerly to begin to raise the federal funds rate, that the fear is that the markets will say, oh my God, there's going to be this huge tightening of monetary policy and that long-term rates will jump 150 basis points or something, which is not inconceivable because it's hard to know what signal markets will take from the action the Fed takes. So there are some risks there. There are always risks whenever policy is tightened. But, you know, to conclude that because there are some difficulties of unwinding or some risks of volatility and so on that you shouldn't have done in the first place, I think it's a complete non sequitur because the U.S. economy needed it. The other tools were absent. Fiscal policy was, after 2009, was pretty much dead. Interest rates couldn't be any lower. What else was there? And I think on the whole, it's worked pretty well. And I would again point to both the inflation and the growth performance of the U.S. economy as being consistent with about the right level of monetary policy.
So that's an interesting one because it's the jobs report on Friday was very positive. As you say, interest rates, inflation has kept very much under control. It hasn't gone into deflation or hyperinflation or anything like it. What do you think your European colleagues could have learnt from what the Fed did? The American economy is now in more robust shape. We heard from our macroeconomist a little earlier to say, actually, America might be about to do the cowboy thing and ride over the hill to save the world. But I'm paraphrasing Olaf. It's what else should have people done, or could they still do compared with what they have done?
Well, the dirty little secret of central banking is that there's an awful lot of, it's kind of an incestuous relationship because, for example, Stanley Fischer, who was the governor of the Bank of Israel, is now the vice chairman of the Federal Reserve, was my thesis advisor at MIT, and he was also Mario Draghi's thesis advisor. It's all intertwined. It's like one of those conspiracies you hear about. So my point of saying that is that I think Mario Draghi's basic understanding of what's going on is probably, you know, his framework is probably not all that different, honestly, from mine, believe it or not. But I really think it's, you know, his talk at Jackson Hole in August easily could have been said by an American central banker. But he has a different political, obviously a very complex political environment. So let me put it to you this way. I would submit that the Eurozone in particular, that a necessary condition for the Eurozone to recover is that inflation in the Eurozone at least be somewhere close to the ECB's target of 2% or a little bit below. It's currently much lower than that. Now that has a couple of implications. First, we know that there are competitiveness problems between Germany in the north versus the south, that competitiveness requires that prices and wages grow more slowly or even fall in the south compared to the north, right? So we know two things. We want inflation to be 2%, and we want wages and prices to grow more slowly in the south than in the north. Now, it doesn't take a whole lot of very complicated arithmetic to figure out that for that to happen, Germany and the other northern countries have to have inflation above 2%. They need 3% inflation. And so that's the first thing, is that it's just not going to work if Germany says, well, we're totally fine as long as German inflation is not above 1.5. You know, that's just not going to work. For the whole system to work, Germany has to accept higher inflation to allow the overall inflation rate to meet the ECB target and to create the increased competitiveness. Now, the question is, how are you going to get to that point? You need the European economy needs more. I mean, it needs a lot of things, but it does need more stimulus. Unfortunately, there are barriers on both sides. On the quantitative easing side, of course, the ECB is putting its toe in. You know, it's making purchases of asset-backed securities and covered bonds. But you know, because for political and legal reasons, it's having difficulty doing a much bigger program, which all else equal would probably be a good thing. Likewise, those countries that have some fiscal capacity, like Germany, would probably be serving the common good by using some of that fiscal capacity to create more demand. So, I know this is the American viewpoint, that Europe has been too restrictive in its fiscal and monetary policies. I don't deny the importance of structural change and structural reform. I'm very happy to see the improved banking unions, the steps to make the ECB the supervisor of large banks and to try to integrate bank regulation across Europe. There are steps being taken on fiscal policy and the like. And of course, structural reforms in terms of, you know, making the sectors more competitive and those kinds of things. Those things are all important, but it's going to take a very, very long time for Europe to recover unless at some point something is done to bring average Eurozone inflation close to the ECB's target, and that's going to require either fiscal or monetary stimulus or some combination. And how the legal and political barriers are going to be overcome, I don't really know. But that seems to me to be essential.
Yeah, and I mean, you're fighting both political issues and also historical ones. You know, Germany doesn't like inflation and has got, you know, a whole history around that is in a very different place than a lot of other countries. And so it's, you know, your job was tough, but Mario Draghi has, he has 17 congresses to try and deal with.
I have the greatest sympathy. I talk to Mario periodically. I have great respect for him. I think he did a great job. Before he was even the head of the ECB, he was the head of the Financial Stability Board, which nobody knows what that is, but it was an international body that led the global effort to do financial regulation reform, and he did a very nice job there, and that helped him get the job at the ECB. So I think he's been a very constructive player throughout the whole crisis, and I have a great relationship with him, and I think like I said, I think our basic frameworks aren't all that different. But again, he's facing a situation where he is essentially, the ECB is basically the only Eurozone-wide effective institution that can really act on a macroeconomic basis. And everything else requires all this coordination among 17 or 18, whatever it is now, countries. And that's obviously very difficult.
Somewhere out there's a young Ben Bernanke Jr. writing his PhD thesis on what you did and what you didn't do, sort of you 30 years ago. What do you think he'll be writing about in terms of mistakes and successes?
Well, it'll be I wouldn't pass a thesis like that. So, I mean, he'll have to deal, if he's serious, he's going to have to deal with, again, these hindsight biases and try and understand how decisions were made in real time with imperfect information. Now, in retrospect, you talk about not just, you talking about just monetary policy or Fed policy more broadly. I mean, Fed policy included regulatory policies that led up to the crisis. The financial regulatory structure in the United States had lots of gaps and lots of inconsistencies in it. The Fed and other supervisors made mistakes in terms of not being sufficiently proactive in forcing some institutions to clean up their books and to better improve their risk management. I think that the Fed was a little slow, I think, or, although I think in real time you can explain it, but retrospectively the Fed looks a little slow in identifying the source of the crisis. And also a little bit too optimistic about the pace of recovery after the crisis. And perhaps, one argument would be that the Fed should have been more aggressive even earlier. Another area where we've been criticized, I think only partially fairly, is in the bailouts, of Bear Stearns, Lehman, AIG. The general view as well, the Fed and Treasury were very inconsistent. They confused people and so on. And the way I lived it, the way I experienced it, was that we were quite consistent. Our goal was to prevent the collapse of any systemically important institution. The problem was that the circumstances for each company were different. We only had a limited set of tools, and so we couldn't set up a comprehensive, systematic regime for resolving these failing companies. We had to use whatever tools we had, and the result was we were unable to save Lehman. We just didn't have the tools, but we did find tools to save AIG. It wasn't because we changed our minds about the desirability of saving or protecting these companies. Those are just some things that obviously will be examined for a long time. One last thing I would say, if you asked me personally what I thought I regret, it would be, Geithner made this point in his book. He said, well, we kind of won the battle, but we lost the war because we stopped the crisis and we stabilized the system and we got the economy back on track. But in doing so, we alienated large swaths of the American people, of the public, because from their point of view, bailing out AIG was basically doing favors for Wall Street and had nothing to do with them. And our arguments that if AIG had failed, that the U.S. economy would have been in even worse condition is a difficult one to process. And I made an effort, as you probably know, to go out and be on television programs and so on and try to explain what we were doing. But the Fed needs to really step up. We're so far away from the world where central banks were these secretive institutions that nobody knew anything about. We're operating behind closed doors. We have a much more transparent world now. Central banks have to be much more transparent. And I'm glad that Janet Yellen is now in that position, because I think she's pretty good at talking to ordinary people, and she has a pretty common touch. And it's going to be crucial both for good economic policy and for the viability of the Fed and its independence that we explain to the public, what exactly the Fed is, why it does what it does, why what it's doing is in the interest of Main Street and not just Wall Street. And if we can't win those battles, then in the longer term, there's going to be further restrictions, limitations, and so on the Fed's authorities, which is not simply a bureaucratic turf war. Those are restrictions that are going to make a big difference the next time there's a crisis. So the House of Representatives, for example, just passed a bill eliminating all emergency lending authorities of the Fed. And if we had another crisis like the one we just had, and those authorities were completely eliminated, the government would simply have no tool to try to calm the crisis.
Moving forward, the US role in the world. Do you see in our lifetimes the idea that the US economy will be eclipsed by another? I mean, we heard in the 70s it will be Japan, and we've heard quite recently it'll be China, the Eurozone. Where do you take it as one economy? Do you still think that the American supremacy is going to last significantly into this century?
Well, I mean, supremacy is that's kind of a loaded term. U.S. is a very strong and dynamic economy. Has a lot of strengths, a lot of weaknesses. I think it will be, for all effective purposes, the largest economy in the world. I mean, there's some discussion about how China, on some kinds of calculations, will be bigger than the U.S., but these calculations don't really, they're based on what's called purchasing power parity, which means basically that you're counting haircuts in rural China at the same price as haircuts in New York City. There's all kinds of technicalities that are not really relevant. In terms of international trade, in terms of innovation, productivity, standards of living, and so on, the U.S. is going to stay high for a long time. It has a lot of very substantial strengths. The U.S. demographics are actually pretty good compared to other industrial countries. We have a lot of immigration. Our population is somewhat younger and has a higher birth rate. So the demographics are somewhat better. We've got a lot of great universities. We've got good R&D technical change. There's a lot of innovation takes place in the United States, Silicon Valley, those sorts of things. We have a very strong entrepreneurial tradition, and the financial markets are set up to promote that, venture capital, private equity, those kinds of things. So there's some definite strengths. And I think that those will keep the United States in the forefront of industrial countries. And emerging markets, the kind of growth they've seen is not going to continue. I mean, eventually they're going to begin to moderate. And what we find historically is the real challenge is once you get to sort of the South Korea level, going above that kind of middle income level is very difficult. So there are some definite positives that the U.S. has over and above the fact that it's currently in a pretty good recovery. But it also has obviously a lot of substantial weaknesses, including weaknesses in our educational system, our healthcare system. There's a lot more inequality than we would like, which means that Americans generally are quite dissatisfied with their economy because even though it's been growing, a lot of the benefits of the growth are accruing to the upper income folks. There's so many considerations, but I do think that in terms of an investment opportunity, in terms of global influence in financial and capital markets, I think the U.S. is placed to continue to be very important. And it has some fundamental strengths, but, of course, in size and sophistication, it's about the same as the European Union. So the European Union gets back on growth path. That will be that'll be the closest possible competitor, I think. But economies are not really about international competition. They're about what's happening within the economy in terms of productivity gains, improving living standards, improving equality. And on some of those things, the U.S. does pretty well, and some it doesn't do so well.
Do you think that also applies for everything you've just said to the dollar and the dollar's power within the world and the economic system?
Recent events have, if anything, strengthened the dollar's role as a trade currency, as a reserves currency. If you think about, there's nothing remotely in Europe, Japan, China, elsewhere, there's nothing remotely like U.S. Treasury markets, for example, in their depth and liquidity. So yes, I think that while the dollar will someday be eclipsed, or there'll be more of a basket type approach for the immediate future, I think that's not going to change. Now, the premise that I would like, implicit in your question, I think, is the idea that this is a good thing for the United States. And I think arguably it's not necessarily such a great thing for the United States. Just to give one example, because the dollar is a reserve currency and people want to hold it, that tends to strengthen the dollar relative to where it otherwise would be, which is a contributor to the fact that the U.S. continues to have trade deficits. And one of the reasons that we've lacked demand domestically is because some of our demand is being siphoned off into foreign trade. So for a number of reasons, it's not completely clear that being the reserve currency is a completely unmixed blessing. I think there are definite disadvantages to it as well.
When you were at the Fed, and I assume things still apply, when you're looking at setting interest rates, setting policy, you obviously, your primary responsibility is to the US, but you also look at the effects that will cascade out through the rest of the world. And it's particularly nowadays with kind of emerging markets like Turkey, other countries that are trying to get that leg up.
Yeah, of course, the Fed was criticized by certain folks, including Brazil and China. There was some prominent criticism from Governor Rajan in India. So let me just make a couple of comments. I mean, it's not completely wrong, but let me make a couple of comments. One is that the idea the U.S. ignores the interests of other countries is just absolutely wrong. I can tell you as a personal matter that I attended at least a dozen international meetings, at least, every year. And invariably, they always began, Chairman Bernanke, would you please give us an overview of the U.S. economy? And I would do that, and then I would take questions and comments. I would explain what we were doing and so on. So there was always an enormous amount of communication and consultation with the emerging markets about U.S. policy. So when they had concerns, they let us know. Secondly, of course, the United States is part of an international system. So even from the U.S.'s narrow parochial perspective, a stable international system is important. We've certainly thought about that. But of course, part of a stable system is that there be sources of growth in the global economy. And, you know, when I would talk to emerging market authorities, and they say, well, you know, the quantitative easing is causing us some problems. And I'd say, well, you know, we need it in order to have a strong U.S. economy, and a strong U.S. economy is certainly very important for you because you sell a lot of goods to us and so on. And they would say, oh, yeah, we agree. We don't think you should change anything. We're just telling you we're having some problems from this. But the fact that a strong U.S. economy is so important means that there's benefit as well as cost from U.S. policy. The last thing to say, I think, is that part of the reason there's a problem is that is because many emerging market countries are not comfortable letting their exchange rates fluctuate. So take China, for example. China keeps the renminbi undervalued, less so than it used to be, but still meaningfully. And so if you're Turkey or if you're Brazil, you're stuck because on the one hand, if you let your exchange rate fluctuate, so if you allow your exchange rate to appreciate as the U.S. does easy monetary policy, which would be the natural response, then you're no longer competitive with China in international markets. But if you don't let your exchange rate appreciate, if you intervene to keep the exchange rate where it is in order to maintain your competitiveness with China, the fact that you're keeping your exchange rate unchanged basically means that you're importing U.S. monetary policy into your own economy, even if that's not appropriate for your own economy. So it isn't just the U.S. policy, it's the combination of U.S. policy and other industrial economies which have easy monetary policy on the one hand, but on the other hand, the fact that many emerging economies are not willing to let their exchange rates adjust to absorb the implications of that and to allow for differences in monetary stimulus across countries. So I think the bottom line is that our international monetary system is not really where it should be. And over the next decade or two, I'm sure there'll be a lot of work to try to figure out how to set up the international monetary system so that countries that need to do stimulus for domestic purposes will be able to do that. And at the same time, you know, that considerations of trade and capital flows will also enter in the calculus.
Using our last few minutes, so just maybe coming closer to home for our European audience here, we've talked about the problems and the challenges facing the Eurozone and Euro generally. Interest rates, form of quantitative easing. Are there any tools in the kit bag that are there that are yet to be used? If all else had failed, where would you have gone next after quantitative easing if it hadn't have?
Well, there's kind of two directions that the ECB could go. So let's put aside fiscal policy, which there is some scope for that. But on the monetary side, there's at least a couple of directions. One is that the quantitative easing that's been done so far is actually pretty modest. So you could do a lot more. And of course, there's the issue, what do you buy? And those are the political issues we were talking about before. The other dimension, which the ECB has only put its toe in, is in communication policy. So Draghi has said that the rates will be low for whatever foreseeable future or for a long time or whatever. As the US did, as Canada did, as Japan did, you could be more explicit about that and say, we're not going to raise rates until inflation hits 2%, for example, and create a stronger presumption of low rates for longer. But it's difficult. I mean, quite honestly, we're in a world where we used to think, one of the weaknesses of our previous analysis, we used to think that monetary policy could pretty much manage the business cycle and leave fiscal policy to make decisions about public priorities, how spending should be done, what taxes should be. It looks to be in a world like we're in now, with very low inflation, very low interest rates, zero interest rates, lower bound, that we need a mix of more of a mix of monetary and fiscal policy. And so in particular, a lot of the complaints just about US monetary policy, US monetary policy is creating adverse capital flows internationally, it's creating bubbles, all these kinds of things are a function of the fact that the Fed is basically the only game in town in Washington, and the only tool the Fed has to stimulate the economy is low interest rates. Now, if there were a better mix of fiscal and monetary policy, then you could get the same amount of stimulus with higher interest rates, and then you would have less concerns about some of these other things. So my bottom line here is that monetary policy can do more, but what we're learning in the States is that if you rely completely on monetary policy and fiscal policy is completely unhelpful, then that means you're going to get very low rates, unconventional policies, and those things are not, as reliable, and they have various side effects. So a better balance, if it can be achieved, is obviously worth pursuing.
I would say that the first decade of this century was divorced from geopolitical risks, but actually the world is, as we were discussing earlier, is getting a nastier place. And in Europe, you have the situation with a resurgent Russia, the crisis with Ukraine, you've got the Middle East. It's a lot tougher out there than it was, say, 5 years ago. There's a lot less international harmony. How should the audience here, how should we take that geopolitical risk that's starting to become more prevalent? Because that's something that needs to be factored into the whole dynamic as well. And how easy or difficult is that to do?
Well, it's very difficult. It's very complicated. As the American saying is, where you stand depends on where you sit. So take Russia and Crimea and so on. I mean, Swedbank has interest in the Baltics, for example. Obviously, this is something that's going to affect, Baltic investment and confidence and the like. Europe is certainly much more vulnerable to this than the United States because Europe depends on Russian gas, Russian trade. So there are obviously, from Europe's perspective, there are some definitely concerns from the Russian situation. From the U.S. perspective, probably much less so. The Middle Eastern situation is very difficult. On the one hand, if you were coming from outer space and I described to you all the mayhem that's going on throughout the Middle East, one of your first guesses would be that oil prices would be $200 a barrel, but they're not. They've come down. Global supply seems adequate. So that's historically, that's been one of the main channels through which Middle Eastern turmoil has affected the global economy. It doesn't seem to be happening. It could still happen. But so far, that hasn't been a problem. I guess the other real flashpoints are nuclear proliferation, Iran, all those questions. Those were been around for a while. There seems to be some, I'm far from a geopolitical expert, but there seems to be some progress, in bringing Iran back to the table, at least. And then finally, the one thing that, the real wild card, the thing that is always so hard to anticipate is terrorism. The 9/11 events in the United States had enormous impact on the economy in the short run, but in the end, the response to that event in terms of domestic security, in terms of foreign interventions, the fiscal cost of that was enormous. The effects on the economy were very big. So I think that's obviously very difficult to predict, but there's some of that risk is certainly elevated now relative to where it was a few years ago. So there's a number of things out there. Mr. Talib would probably have a view on the black swans, that's very hard to predict. But the good news is that, right now at this point, I don't see any part of the world that is, other than the places that are actually in conflict, that have been substantially affected economically. There is some risks out there, and certainly for Europe with Russia, and also to some extent, of course, with the Middle East, which is much closer. But the bigger view is that there's always a certain amount of geopolitical risk going on. And when we started off by talking about the Great Depression, 1933, the depth of the Great Depression, there were other things happening, like the new chancellor in Germany, for example, that are, of course, a far greater consequence for the world than anything that's happening today. So, again, with some perspective, I wouldn't say that we're in a huge geopolitical risk point, but there are some identifiable problems there that need to be monitored pretty carefully.
Are there any other financial risks on the horizon? Not just the black swans, but is there anything that we should be keeping a wary eye on at this point, both as Europeans and more internationally?
Well, I think it's fair that the exit from highly accommodative monetary policy creates some risks of volatility and reaction. I think that some of the asset prices that we see in the United States are, as they like to say, priced for perfection. I think they're priced for a solid continuing recovery without tightening a policy which is either too fast or too slow. So, I think there are some risks to that. But I guess I'd like to emphasize that one of the things the Fed has done, again, is to greatly increase the monitoring and evaluation of what's happening in financial markets, including areas where the Fed does not directly supervise. And the process that the Fed goes through is a two-part process. The first is to say, are there asset prices or credit instruments out there that for one reason or another seem mispriced or that we have some worry about? That's the first question. Then you can identify a few things like leveraged lending and high yield bonds and farmland and a few other things that seem mispriced based on historical norms. That's the first question. But the second question then is, okay, suppose there is a big shift in the price of that asset. What's the consequence for the system? I think it's what we did wrong with the housing bubble was that we were, the whole time we were arguing, is there a bubble or is not a bubble? How big is it? How will it, the right way to think about the housing bubble would have been not is there or isn't there. It would have been suppose there is, and suppose there's a big adjustment. Suppose house prices fall 30%. What would that do to the system? If you thought about it that way, you could have found the weaknesses maybe, and maybe have done more to prevent the crisis. And that's what the Fed now does with all the stress tests. Now the part of the supervisory process is to require banks to simulate what would happen to their balance sheets if there was a major recession plus a major financial crisis. And by stress testing, then these hypothetical situations, then you can figure out, does it matter? So people are all worried, is the stock market going to drop 10 or 15%? It's possible, I don't know. But the real question is, if that happens, what is the consequence for the stability of the system and for economic growth? And that particular example is one where I think that the system would take it just perfectly well.
Yeah. The final question I have is that famously in England, when Labour lost power in 2010, Liam Byrne was Chief Secretary of the Treasury, and the custom is you leave a letter to your successor. And when David Laws opened the letter as the new Secretary to the Treasury, it just said there's no money left. Liam Byrne has since been demoted in the shadow cabinet and now is a sort of junior minister. Most of us would be intrigued. What was in the letter that you left for Janet Yellen?
Well, I didn't have to leave her a letter. Janet and I worked together for a long time, and she had enormous experience. She's far better, I don't want to say qualified, but she has far more experience at the Fed than I did. And she was a governor, then she became the president of the Federal Reserve Bank of San Francisco, then she was my vice chairman. She worked closely with me in all our policies, and there's just a lot of continuity between us. And so my only advice to her, besides the fact that she should not try to get this job, was, was to keep doing what you're doing, because I felt that we were on a good track. However, when I was the chairman of the Council of Economic Advisors in the White House under President Bush, I continued a tradition which is longstanding in the CEA, which is that when the new chairman of the CEA comes in, there's a note on the desk which says, if situation becomes difficult, open the right-hand lower drawer, and you open it up, and there's a quart of Scotch whiskey in there. And that was my best advice.
Excellent. Dr. Bernanke, I'd like to thank you very much for your honesty, your openness, your candor. I know you're relatively recently demobbed, so it's always a challenge to be as open as you are. And the audience appreciates enormously the insight that you've given to us, both in terms of the last amazingly tumultuous 8 years, but also a little bit of insight into what might be happening over the course of the next few.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and I hope you're having a great conference and beautiful place you have here.
Yeah.
So good. So thank you very, very much.
Pleasure.